Classics in Audiobook presents The Life of Claudius by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. Part 1. Suetonius presents Claudius as a figure whose reign combined administrative competence with persistent instability inside the imperial household. Claudius was born during the reign of Augustus and came to power in 41 CE after the assassination of his nephew Caligula, elevated by the Praetorian Guard rather than by senatorial consensus. His government expanded Roman citizenship, reorganized provincial administration, and completed major public works, yet his authority was repeatedly shaped by the influence of freedmen and by conflicts within his family. Ancient writers disagreed sharply about his character, intelligence, and political judgment, leaving a record marked by both praise and hostility. Suetonius structures the biography according to his usual method: ancestry, omens, early life, accession, public acts, private habits, and death. He assembles material from official records, anecdotes, and hostile tradition, arranging it thematically rather than chronologically. The result is a portrait that emphasizes Claudius' physical impairments, his scholarly interests, his administrative diligence, and his vulnerability to manipulation. Suetonius records both his legal reforms and his personal excesses, presenting a ruler whose achievements were substantial but whose court was marked by intrigue and instability. The biography remains a central source for understanding the political culture of the early empire and the challenges of Julio-Claudian rule. Livia, having married Augustus when she was pregnant, was within 3 months afterwards delivered of Drusus, the father of Claudius Caesar, who had at first the praenomen of Decimus, but afterwards that of Nero, and it was suspected that he was begotten in adultery by his father-in-law. The following verse, however, was immediately in everyone's mouth. 9 months for common births the fates decree, but, for the great, reduce the term to 3. This Drusus, during the time of his being quaestor and praetor, commanded in the Rhaetian and German wars, and was the first of all the Roman generals who navigated the northern ocean. He made likewise some prodigious trenches beyond the Rhine, which to this day are called by his name. He overthrew the enemy in several battles, and drove them far back into the depths of the desert. Nor did he desist from pursuing them, until an apparition, in the form of a barbarian woman of more than human size, appeared to him, and, in the Latin tongue, forbade him to proceed any farther. For these achievements he had the honor of an ovation and the triumphal ornaments. After his praetorship, he immediately entered on the office of consul, and returning again to Germany, died of disease in the summer encampment, which thence obtained the name of the Unlucky Camp. His corpse was carried to Rome by the principal persons of the several municipalities and colonies upon the road, being met and received by the recorders of each place, and buried in the Campus Martius. In honor of his memory, the army erected a monument, round which the soldiers used, annually, upon a certain day, to march in solemn procession, and persons deputed from the several cities of Gaul performed religious rites. The Senate likewise, among various other honors, decreed for him a triumphal arch of marble, with trophies, in the Appian Way, and gave the cognomen of Germanicus to him and his posterity. In him the civil and military virtues were equally displayed, for, besides his victories, he gained from the enemy the spolia opima, and frequently marked out the German chiefs in the midst of their army, and encountered them in single combat, at the utmost hazard of his life. He likewise often declared that he would, some time or other, if possible, restore the ancient government. In this account, I suppose, some have ventured to affirm that Augustus was jealous of him, and recalled him, and because he made no haste to comply with the order, took him off by poison. This I mention, that I may not be guilty of any omission, more than because I think it either true or probable, since Augustus loved him so much when living, that he always, in his wills, made him joint heir with his sons, as he once declared in the Senate, and upon his decease, extolled him in a speech to the people, to that degree, that he prayed the gods to make his Caesars like him, and to grant himself as honorable an exit out of this world as they had given him. And not satisfied with inscribing upon his tomb an epitaph in verse composed by himself, he wrote likewise the history of his life in prose. He had by the younger Antonius several children, but left behind him only 3, namely, Germanicus, Livilla, and Claudius. Claudius was born at Lyons, in the consulship of Julius Antonius and Fabius Africanus, upon the 1st of August, the very day upon which an altar was first dedicated there to Augustus. He was named Tiberius Claudius Drusus, but soon afterwards, upon the adoption of his elder brother into the Julian family, he assumed the cognomen of Germanicus. He was left an infant by his father, and during almost the whole of his minority, and for some time after he attained the age of manhood, was afflicted with a variety of obstinate disorders, insomuch that his mind and body being greatly impaired, he was, even after his arrival at years of maturity, never thought sufficiently qualified for any public or private employment. He was, therefore, during a long time, and even after the expiration of his minority, under the direction of a pedagogue, who, he complains in a certain memoir, was a barbarous wretch, and formerly superintendent of the mule drivers, who was selected for his governor, on purpose to correct him severely on every trifling occasion. On account of this crazy constitution of body and mind, at the spectacle of gladiators, which he gave the people, jointly with his brother, in honour of his father's memory, he presided, muffled up in a pallium, a new fashion. When he assumed the manly habit, he was carried in a litter, at midnight, to the Capitol, without the usual ceremony. He applied himself, however, from an early age, with great assiduity to the study of the liberal sciences, and frequently published specimens of his skill in each of them. But never, with all his endeavours, could he attain to any public post in the government, or afford any hope of arriving at distinction thereafter. His mother, Antonia, frequently called him an abortion of a man that had been only begun, but never finished, by nature. And when she would upbraid any one with dullness, she said, he was a greater fool than her son, Claudius. His grandmother, Augusta, always treated him with the utmost contempt, very rarely spoke to him, and when she did admonish him upon any occasion, it was in writing, very briefly and severely, or by messengers. His sister, Livilla, upon hearing that he was about to be created emperor, openly and loudly expressed her indignation that the Roman people should experience a fate so severe and so much below their grandeur. To exhibit the opinion, both favourable and otherwise, entertained concerning him by Augustus, his great-uncle, I have here subjoined some extracts from the letters of that emperor. I have had some conversation with Tiberius, according to your desire, my dear Livia, as to what must be done with your grandson, Tiberius, at the games of Mars. We are both agreed in this, that, once for all, we ought to determine what course to take with him. For if he be really sound and, so to speak, quite right in his intellects, why should we hesitate to promote him by the same steps and degrees we did his brother? But if we find him below par, and deficient both in body and mind, we must beware of giving occasion for him and ourselves to be laughed at by the world, which is ready enough to make such things the subject of mirth and derision. For we never shall be easy, if we are always to be debating upon every occasion of this kind, without settling, in the first instance, whether he be really capable of public offices or not. With regard to what you consult me about at the present moment, I am not against his superintending the feast of the priests, in the games of Mars, if he will suffer himself to be governed by his kinsman, Silanus's son, that he may do nothing to make the people stare and laugh at him. But I do not approve of his witnessing the Accession games from the Pulvina. He will be there exposed to view in the very front of the theatre. Nor do I like that he should go to the Alban Mount, or be at Rome during the Latin festivals. For if he be capable of attending his brother to the Mount, why is he not made prefect of the city? Thus, my dear Livia, you have my thoughts upon the matter. In my opinion, we ought to settle this affair once for all, that we may not be always in suspense between hope and fear. You may, if you think proper, give your kinsman Antonia this part of my letter to read. In another letter, he writes as follows, I shall invite the youth, Tiberius, every day during your absence, to supper, that he may not sup alone with his friends Sulpicius and Athenodorus. I wish the poor creature was more cautious and attentive in the choice of some one, whose manners, air, and gait might be proper for his imitation. In things of consequence he sadly fails. Where his mind does not run astray, he discovers a noble disposition. In a third letter, he says, "Let me die, my dear Livia, if I am not astonished that the declamation of your grandson, Tiberius, should please me, for how he who talks so ill should be able to declaim so clearly and properly, I cannot imagine." There is no doubt but Augustus, after this, came to a resolution upon the subject, and, accordingly, left him invested with no other honour than that of the augural priesthood, naming him amongst the heirs of the third degree, who were but distantly allied to his family, for a sixth part of his estate only, with a legacy of no more than 800,000 sesterces. Upon his requesting some office in the state, Tiberius granted him the honorary appendages of the consulship, and when he pressed for a legitimate appointment, the emperor wrote word back that he sent him 40 gold pieces for his expenses during the festivals of the Saturnalia and Sigillaria. Upon this, laying aside all hope of advancement, he resigned himself entirely to an indolent life, living in great privacy, one while in his gardens, or a villa which he had near the city, another while in Campania, where he passed his time in the lowest society, by which means, besides his former character of a dull, heavy fellow, he acquired that of a drunkard and gamester. Notwithstanding this sort of life, much respect was shown him both in public and private. The equestrian order twice made choice of him to intercede on their behalf, once to obtain from the consuls the favour of bearing on their shoulders the corpse of Augustus to Rome, and a second time to congratulate him upon the death of Sejanus. When he entered the theatre, they used to rise, and put off their cloaks. The Senate likewise decreed that he should be added to the number of the Augustal College of Priests, who were chosen by lot, and soon afterwards, when his house was burnt down, that it should be rebuilt at the public charge, and that he should have the privilege of giving his vote amongst the men of consular rank. This decree was, however, repealed, Tiberius insisting to have him excused on account of his imbecility, and promising to make good his loss at his own expense. But at his death, he named him in his will, amongst his third heirs, for a third part of his estate, leaving him besides a legacy of 2 millions of sesterces, and expressly recommending him to the armies, the Senate and people of Rome, amongst his other relations. At last, Gaius, his brother's son, upon his advancement to the empire, endeavouring to gain the affections of the public by all the arts of popularity, Claudius also was admitted to public offices, and held the consulship jointly with his nephew for 2 months. As he was entering the forum for the first time with the fasces, an eagle which was flying that way alighted upon his right shoulder. A second consulship was also allotted him, to commence at the expiration of the 4th year. He sometimes presided at the public spectacles as the representative of Gaius, being always, on those occasions, complimented with the acclamations of the people, wishing him all happiness, sometimes under the title of the emperor's uncle, and sometimes under that of Germanicus's brother. Still he was subjected to many slights. If at any time he came in late to supper, he was obliged to walk round the room some time before he could get a place at table. When he indulged himself with sleep after eating, which was a common practice with him, the company used to throw olive stones and dates at him, and the buffoons who attended would wake him, as if it were only in jest, with a cane or a whip. Sometimes they would put slippers upon his hands, as he lay snoring, that he might, upon awaking, rub his face with them. He was not only exposed to contempt, but sometimes likewise to considerable danger, first, in his consulship, for, having been too remiss in providing and erecting the statues of Gaius's brothers, Nero and Drusus, he was very near being deprived of his office, and afterwards he was continually harassed with informations against him by one or other, sometimes even by his own domestics. When the conspiracy of Lepidus and Gatulicus was discovered, being sent with some other deputies into Germany, to congratulate the emperor upon the occasion, he was in danger of his life, Gaius being greatly enraged, and loudly complaining that his uncle was sent to him, as if he was a boy who wanted a governor. Some even say that he was thrown into a river in his travelling dress. From this period, he voted in the Senate always the last of the members of consular rank, being called upon after the rest, on purpose to disgrace him. A charge for the forgery of a will was also allowed to be prosecuted, though he had only signed it as a witness. At last, being obliged to pay 8 millions of sesterces on entering upon a new office of priesthood, he was reduced to such straits in his private affairs, that in order to discharge his bond to the treasury, he was under the necessity of exposing to sale his whole estate by an order of the prefects. Having spent the greater part of his life under these and the like circumstances, he came at last to the empire in the 50th year of his age, by a very surprising turn of fortune. Being, as well as the rest, prevented from approaching Gaius by the conspirators, who dispersed the crowd, under the pretext of his desiring to be private, he retired into an apartment called the Hermaeum, and soon afterwards, terrified by the report of Gaius being slain, he crept into an adjoining balcony, where he hid himself behind the hangings of the door. A common soldier, who happened to pass that way, spying his feet, and desirous to discover who he was, pulled him out, when immediately recognizing him, he threw himself in a great fright at his feet, and saluted him by the title of Emperor. He then conducted him to his fellow soldiers, who were all in a great rage, and irresolute what they should do. They put him into a litter, and as the slaves of the palace had all fled, took their turns in carrying him on their shoulders, and brought him into the camp, sad and trembling, the people who met him lamenting his situation, as if the poor innocent was being carried to execution. Being received within the ramparts, he continued all night with the sentries on guard, recovered somewhat from his fright, but in no great hopes of the succession. For the consuls, with the senate and civic troops, had possessed themselves of the Forum and Capitol, with a determination to assert the public liberty, and he being sent for likewise, by a tribune of the people, to the Senate House, to give his advice upon the present juncture of affairs, returned answer, I am under constraint, and cannot possibly come. The day afterwards, the Senate being dilatory in their proceedings, and worn out by divisions amongst themselves, while the people who surrounded the Senate House shouted that they would have one master, naming Claudius, he suffered the soldiers assembled under arms to swear allegiance to him, promising them 15,000 sesterces a man, he being the first of the Caesars who purchased the submission of the soldiers with money. Having thus established himself in power, his first object was to abolish all remembrance of the 2 preceding days, in which a revolution in the state had been canvassed. Accordingly, he passed an act of perpetual oblivion and pardon for everything said or done during that time, and this he faithfully observed, with the exception only of putting to death a few tribunes and centurions concerned in the conspiracy against Gaius, both as an example, and because he understood that they had also planned his own death. He now turned his thoughts towards paying respect to the memory of his relations. His most solemn and usual oath was, by Augustus. He prevailed upon the Senate to decree divine honours to his grandmother Livia, with a chariot in the Accession procession drawn by elephants, as had been appointed for Augustus, and public offerings to the shades of his parents. Besides which, he instituted Accession games for his father, to be celebrated every year, upon his birthday, and, for his mother, a chariot to be drawn through the circus, with the title of Augusta, which had been refused by his grandmother. To the memory of his brother, to which, upon all occasions, he showed a great regard, he gave a Greek comedy, to be exhibited in the public diversions at Naples, and awarded the crown for it, according to the sentence of the judges in that solemnity. Nor did he omit to make honourable and grateful mention of Mark Antony, declaring by a proclamation, that he the more earnestly insisted upon the observation of his father Drusus's birthday, because it was likewise that of his grandfather Antony. He completed the marble arch near Pompey's theatre, which had formerly been decreed by the Senate in honour of Tiberius, but which had been neglected. And though he cancelled all the acts of Gaius, yet he forbade the day of his assassination, notwithstanding it was that of his own accession to the empire, to be reckoned amongst the festivals. But with regard to his own aggrandizement, he was sparing and modest, declining the title of emperor, and refusing all excessive honours. He celebrated the marriage of his daughter and the birthday of a grandson with great privacy, at home. He recalled none of those who had been banished, without a decree of the Senate, and requested of them permission for the prefect of the military tribunes and praetorian guards to attend him in the Senate House, and also that they would be pleased to bestow upon his procurators judicial authority in the provinces. He asked of the consuls likewise the privilege of holding fairs upon his private estate. He frequently assisted the magistrates in the trial of causes, as one of their assessors. And when they gave public spectacles, he would rise up with the rest of the spectators, and salute them both by words and gestures. When the tribunes of the people came to him while he was on the tribunal, he excused himself, because, on account of the crowd, he could not hear them unless they stood. In a short time, by this conduct, he wrought himself so much into the favour and affection of the public, that when, upon his going to Ostia, a report was spread in the city that he had been waylaid and slain, the people never ceased cursing the soldiers for traitors, and the senate as parricides, until 1 or 2 persons, and presently after several others, were brought by the magistrates upon the rostra, who assured them that he was alive, and not far from the city, on his way home. Conspiracies, however, were formed against him, not only by individuals separately, but by a faction, and at last his government was disturbed with a civil war. A low fellow was found with a poniard about him, near his chamber, at midnight. 2 men of the equestrian order were discovered waiting for him in the streets, armed with a tuck and a huntsman's dagger, one of them intending to attack him as he came out of the theatre, and the other as he was sacrificing in the temple of Mars. Gallus Asinius and Statilius Corvinus, grandsons of the 2 orators, Pollio and Messala, formed a conspiracy against him, in which they engaged many of his freedmen and slaves. Furious Camillus Scribonianus, his lieutenant in Dalmatia, broke into rebellion, but was reduced in the space of 5 days, the legions which he had seduced from their oath of fidelity relinquishing their purpose upon an alarm occasioned by ill omens. For when orders were given them to march, to meet their new emperor, the eagles could not be decorated, nor the standards pulled out of the ground, whether it was by accident or a divine interposition. Besides his former consulship, he held the office afterwards 4 times, the first 2 successively, but the following, after an interval of 4 years each, the last for 6 months, the others for 2, and the third, upon his being chosen in the room of a consul who died, which had never been done by any of the emperors before him. Whether he was consul or out of office, he constantly attended the courts for the administration of justice, even upon such days as were solemnly observed as days of rejoicing in his family, or by his friends, and sometimes upon the public festivals of ancient institution. Nor did he always adhere strictly to the letter of the laws, but overruled the rigour or lenity of many of their enactments, according to his sentiments of justice and equity. For where persons lost their suits by insisting upon more than appeared to be their due, before the judges of private causes, he granted them the indulgence of a second trial. And with regard to such as were convicted of any great delinquency, he even exceeded the punishment appointed by law, and condemned them to be exposed to wild beasts. But in hearing and determining causes, he exhibited a strange inconsistency of temper, being at one time circumspect and sagacious, at another inconsiderate and rash, and sometimes frivolous, and like one out of his mind. In correcting the roll of judges, he struck off the name of one who, concealing the privilege his children gave him to be excused from serving, had answered to his name, as too eager for the office. Another who was summoned before him in a cause of his own, but alleged that the affair did not properly come under the emperor's cognizance, but that of the ordinary judges, he ordered to plead the cause himself immediately before him, and show in a case of his own how equitable a judge he would prove in that of other persons. A woman refusing to acknowledge her own son, and there being no clear proof on either side, he obliged her to confess the truth, by ordering her to marry the young man. He was much inclined to determine causes in favour of the parties who appeared, against those who did not, without inquiring whether their absence was occasioned by their own fault or by real necessity. On proclamation of a man's being convicted of forgery, and that he ought to have his hand cut off, he insisted that an executioner should be immediately sent for, with a Spanish sword and a block. A person being prosecuted for falsely assuming the freedom of Rome, and a frivolous dispute arising between the advocates in the cause, whether he ought to make his appearance in the Roman or Grecian dress, to show his impartiality, he commanded him to change his clothes several times according to the character he assumed in the accusation or defence. An anecdote is related of him, and believed to be true, that, in a particular cause, he delivered his sentence in writing thus, "I am in favour of those who have spoken the truth." By this he so much forfeited the good opinion of the world, that he was everywhere and openly despised. A person making an excuse for the non-appearance of a witness whom he had sent for from the provinces, declared it was impossible for him to appear, concealing the reason for some time. At last, after several interrogatories were put to him on the subject, he answered, "The man is dead," to which Claudius replied, "I think that is a sufficient excuse." Another, thanking him for suffering a person who was prosecuted to make his defence by counsel, added, "And yet it is no more than what is usual." I have likewise heard some old men say that the advocates used to abuse his patients so grossly that they would not only call him back as he was quitting the tribunal, but would seize him by the lap of his coat, and sometimes catch him by the heels, to make him stay. That such behaviour, however strange, is not incredible, will appear from this anecdote. Some obscure Greek, who was a litigant, had an altercation with him, in which he called out, "You are an old fool." It is certain that a Roman knight, who was prosecuted by an impotent device of his enemies on a false charge of abominable obscenity with women, observing that common strumpets were summoned against him and allowed to give evidence, upbraided Claudius in very harsh and severe terms with his folly and cruelty, and threw his style, and some books which he had in his hands, in his face, with such violence as to wound him severely in the cheek. He likewise assumed the censorship, which had been discontinued since the time that Paulus and Plancus had jointly held it. But this also he administered very unequally, and with a strange variety of humour and conduct. In his review of the knights, he passed over, without any mark of disgrace, a profligate young man, only because his father spoke of him in the highest terms. "For," said he, "his father is his proper censor." Another, who was infamous for debauching youths and for adultery, he only admonished to indulge his youthful inclinations more sparingly, or at least more cautiously, adding, "Why must I know what mistress you keep?" When, at the request of his friends, he had taken off a mark of infamy which he had set upon one knight's name, he said, "Let the blot, however, remain." He not only struck out of the list of judges, but likewise deprived of the freedom of Rome, an illustrious man of the highest provincial rank in Greece, only because he was ignorant of the Latin language. Nor in this review did he suffer any one to give an account of his conduct by an advocate, but obliged each man to speak for himself in the best way he could. He disgraced many, and some that little expected it, and for a reason entirely new, namely, for going out of Italy without his license, and one likewise for having in his province been the familiar companion of a king, observing that, in former times, Rabirius Posthumus had been prosecuted for treason, although he only went after Ptolemy to Alexandria for the purpose of securing payment of a debt. Having tried to brand with disgrace several others, he, to his own greater shame, found them generally innocent, through the negligence of the persons employed to inquire into their characters. Those whom he charged with living in celibacy, with want of children or estate, proving themselves to be husbands, parents, and in affluent circumstances. One of the knights who was charged with stabbing himself laid his bosom bare, to show that there was not the least mark of violence upon his body. The following incidents were remarkable in his censorship. He ordered a car, plated with silver, and of very sumptuous workmanship, which was exposed for sale in the Sigillaria, to be purchased and broken in pieces before his eyes. He published 20 proclamations in one day, in one of which he advised the people, since the vintage was very plentiful, to have their casks well secured at the bung with pitch, and in another he told them that nothing would sooner cure the bite of a viper than the sap of the yew tree. He undertook only one expedition, and that was of short duration. The triumphal ornaments decreed him by the Senate he considered as beneath the imperial dignity, and was therefore resolved to have the honour of a real triumph. For this purpose he selected Britain, which had never been attempted by any one since Julius Caesar, and was then chafing with rage, because the Romans would not give up some deserters. Accordingly, he set sail from Ostia, but was twice very near being wrecked by the boisterous wind called Circius, upon the coast of Liguria, and near the islands called Stochades. Having marched by land from Marseilles to Gessoriacum, he thence passed over to Britain, and part of the island submitting to him, within a few days after his arrival, without battle or bloodshed, he returned to Rome in less than 6 months from the time of his departure, and triumphed in the most solemn manner, to witness which he not only gave leave to governors of provinces to come to Rome, but even to some of the exiles. Among the spoils taken from the enemy, he fixed upon the pediment of his house in the Palatium a naval crown, in token of his having passed, and, as it were, conquered the ocean, and had it suspended near the civic crown which was there before. Messalina, his wife, followed his chariot in a covered litter. Those who had attained the honor of triumphal ornaments in the same war rode behind. The rest followed on foot, wearing the robe with the broad stripes. Crassus Frugi was mounted upon a horse richly caparisoned, in a robe embroidered with palm leaves, because this was the second time of his obtaining that honor. He paid particular attention to the care of the city, and to have it well supplied with provisions. A dreadful fire happening in the Emiliana, which lasted some time, he passed 2 nights in the diribitorium, and the soldiers and gladiators not being in sufficient numbers to extinguish it, he caused the magistrates to summon the people out of all the streets in the city to their assistance. Placing bags of money before him, he encouraged them to do their utmost, declaring that he would reward every one on the spot, according to their exertions. During a scarcity of provisions, occasioned by bad crops for several successive years, he was stopped in the middle of the forum by the mob, who so abused him, at the same time pelting him with fragments of bread, that he had some difficulty in escaping into the palace by a back door. He therefore used all possible means to bring provisions to the city, even in the winter. He proposed to the merchants a sure profit, by indemnifying them against any loss that might befall them by storms at sea, and granted great privileges to those who built ships for that traffic. To a citizen of Rome he gave an exemption from the penalty of the Papipopean law, to one who had only the privilege of Latium, the freedom of the city, and to women the rights which by law belonged to those who had 4 children, which enactments are in force to this day. He completed some important public works, which, though not numerous, were very useful. The principal were an aqueduct, which had been begun by Gaius, an emissary for the discharge of the waters of the Fucine Lake and the harbour of Ostia, although he knew that Augustus had refused to comply with the repeated application of the Martians for one of these, and that the other had been several times intended by Julius Caesar, but as often abandoned on account of the difficulty of its execution. He brought to the city the cool and plentiful springs of the Claudian water, one of which is called Ceruleus, and the other Curtius and Albudinus, as likewise the river of the new Anio, in a stone canal, and distributed them into many magnificent reservoirs. The canal from the Fucine Lake was undertaken as much for the sake of profit, as for the honour of the enterprise, for there were parties who offered to drain it at their own expense, on condition of their having a grant of the land laid dry. With great difficulty he completed a canal 3 miles in length, partly by cutting through, and partly by tunnelling, a mountain, 30,000 men being constantly employed in the work for 11 years. He formed the harbour at Ostia, by carrying out circular piers on the right and on the left, with a mole protecting, in deep water, the entrance of the port. To secure the foundation of this mole, he sunk the vessel in which the great obelisk had been brought from Egypt, and built upon piles a very lofty tower, in imitation of the Pharos at Alexandria, on which lights were burnt to direct mariners in the night. He often distributed largesses of corn and money among the people, and entertained them with a great variety of public magnificent spectacles, not only such as were usual and in the accustomed places, but some of new invention, and others revived from ancient models, and exhibited in places where nothing of the kind had been ever before attempted. In the games which he presented at the dedication of Pompey's theatre, which had been burnt down, and was rebuilt by him, he presided upon a tribunal erected for him in the orchestra, having first paid his devotions in the temple above, and then coming down through the centre of the circle, while all the people kept their seats in profound silence. He likewise exhibited the secular games, giving out that Augustus had anticipated the regular period, though he himself says in his history that they had been omitted before the age of Augustus, who had calculated the years with great exactness, and again brought them to their regular period. The crier was therefore ridiculed, when he invited people in the usual form, to games which no person had ever before seen, nor ever would again, when many were still living who had already seen them, and some of the performers who had formerly acted in them were now again brought upon the stage. He likewise frequently celebrated the Circensian games in the Vatican, sometimes exhibiting a hunt of wild beasts after every 5 courses. He embellished the Circus Maximus with marble barriers and gilded goals, which before were of common stone and wood, and assigned proper places for the senators, who were used to sit promiscuously with the other spectators. Besides the chariot races, He exhibited there the Trojan game and wild beasts from Africa, which were encountered by a troop of Praetorian knights, with their tribunes, and even the prefect at the head of them. Besides the Salian horse, who drive fierce bulls round the circus, leap upon their backs when they have exhausted their fury, and drag them by the horns to the ground. He gave exhibitions of gladiators in several places, and of various kinds, one yearly on the anniversary of his accession in the Praetorian camp, but without any hunting or the usual apparatus, another in the Scepter as usual, and in the same place, another out of the common way, and of a few days' continuance only, which he called Sportula, because when he was going to present it, he informed the people by proclamation that he invited them to a late supper, got up in haste, and without ceremony. Nor did he lend himself to any kind of public diversion with more freedom and hilarity, insomuch that he would hold out his left hand, and, joined by the common people, count upon his fingers aloud the gold pieces presented to those who came off conquerors. He would earnestly invite the company to be merry, sometimes calling them his masters, with a mixture of insipid, far-fetched jests. Thus, when the people called for Columbus, he said he would give them one when he could catch it. The following was well intended and well timed, having, amidst great applause, spared a gladiator. On the intercession of his 4 sons, he sent a billet immediately round the theatre to remind the people how much it behoved them to get children, since they had before them an example how useful they had been in procuring favour and security for a gladiator. He likewise represented in the Campus Martius the assault and sacking of a town, and the surrender of the British kings, presiding in his general's cloak. Immediately before he drew off the waters from the Fucine lake, he exhibited upon it a naval fight. But the combatants on board the fleets crying out, "Health attend you, noble emperor! We, who are about to peril our lives, salute you," and he replying, "Health attend you too," they all refused to fight, as if by that response he had meant to excuse them. Upon this, he hesitated for a time, whether he should not destroy them all with fire and sword. At last, leaping from his seat, and running along the shore of the lake with tottering steps, the result of his foul excesses, he, partly by fair words, and partly by threats, persuaded them to engage. This spectacle represented an engagement between the fleets of Sicily and Rhodes, consisting each of 12 ships of war, of 3 banks of oars. The signal for the encounter was given by a silver triton, raised by machinery from the middle of the lake. With regard to religious ceremonies, the administration of affairs both civil and military, and the condition of all orders of the people at home and abroad, some practices he corrected, others which had been laid aside he revived, and some regulations he introduced which were entirely new. In appointing new priests for the several colleges, he made no appointments without being sworn. When an earthquake happened in the city, he never failed to summon the people together by the praetor, and appoint holidays for sacred rites. And upon the sight of any ominous bird in the city or capital, he issued an order for a supplication, the words of which, by virtue of his office of high priest, after an exhortation from the rostra, he recited in the presence of the people, who repeated them after him, all workmen and slaves being first ordered to withdraw. If you have enjoyed this audiobook, please consider supporting the channel in one or more of the following ways.